Hi everyone, this is Cathy Skipper from Aromagnosis, and I wanted to do a short video to share with you some clarity that's dropped in recently into our work at Aromagnosis and also sort of in my own journey of healing and how I understand what we're proposing in terms of healing. So one of the things that's been a struggle for Florian and I is really succinctly saying what we do, because we use a lot of concepts from depth psychology. We use aroma. I could list off a load of different themes that we have woven into our own healing journeys. And so it's very difficult to say, this is what we do. And it's been driving me a little bit bonkers. So what I want to share today is my realization of what's at the heart, or what is the framework of healing, the model, the where we're trying to get to in the healing process. But first of all, I want to just share the context. So when I came to America 7 years ago, I very quickly after arriving got a diagnosis for stage 2 cancer, cervical cancer. And so this took me on a deep journey of healing. I went into the underworld. I spent, I would say, 6 years really piecing together my story, my ancestral story, the patterns, how it had been passed down through the line, and how it had resulted finally at this cancer diagnosis. And so a lot of the work that I've been offering through Aromagnosis has come from me using the tools and navigating my own underworld journey and seeing how the tools have helped me to make my way along. And so that's great. It's been very empowering. It's been a really great thing to be able to share what I'm learning in a sort of real time with our students and the people that look at our videos, etc., read our newsletters. But as I said, what is it that is the thread? What's the core of it? How do we explain it has been a big challenge. And that's what's dropped in, that clarity dropped in for me the last couple of weeks. And so one of the big parts of our teaching has centralized around what Carl Jung called the alchemical stages. And they're really a way of seeing how the psyche processes unconscious material continuously. So, as much as the digestive system is continuously processing food, the psyche is continuously processing unconscious material. In the modern world, we tend to ignore it and do other things, eat, drink, go on our phones, work, whatever, have sex, whatever it is, we try and, or many of us try to ignore and repress this unconscious material. But in depth psychology, the idea is to build relationship with it. It's that's really going to help us heal. So the last of the 7 stages that sort of completes the cycle, if you want to see them in an order, although they don't always come in an order, they're quite anarchic, is conjunctio. And conjunctio is the sacred in a marriage. It's the coming together and holding the tension of two opposites. Well, Carl Jung himself said it was very hard for him to explain conjunctio. One of the reasons why I think it was hard was because well, for one, the times were different then, but for two, he was also quite misogynistic. So he saw things from a very masculine point of view. And so the coming together of masculine and feminine energies was difficult for him to really talk about, I think, and to feel inside himself. But anyway, I don't want to say what Carl Jung should have done. He did a great deal. So this conjunctio, or sacred inner union, is the last of the 7 alchemical stages, as I said. And the opposites that come together and that have an effect on the whole of humanity are what we call, among other things, masculine and feminine. And this doesn't mean male and female. I'm not talking about gender. We all have these opposing forces within us that come together to bring about the third. And so let me explain that. And first of all, before I explain it, let's just see other things that we could call it. So I call it masculine and feminine, and I'll explain why in a minute. You could call it unconscious forces and conscious forces. You could call it earth and sky, soul and spirit, yin and yang, etc., etc. So they all refer to these two opposites that come together to make a third. In its most basic biological form, this is the egg and the sperm that come together to create a child. or the ovum and the pollen that come together to create more plants. Every human being on the earth has, in some form or another, these two opposing forces have come together in order to create each human being, whatever the gender. So it's not to do with gender. That's very important. So inside the psyche, we have these two forces, and they come together ultimately to create not a baby or a new plant, but to create a new creative energy, to create our pure essence of what we are here as a human to do, our soul's path, you could call it, personal myth, our creative projects, to be the creative human being we're meant to be. This is really what the internal model of being alive and being healthy is. And that's the clarity that I came to throughout the work. It isn't a clarity that just sort of, oh, let's call it that. It's a clarity that piecing all these different parts and journeys and parts of myself I had to, put back together. I realized it was always about trying to find a more harmonious inner relationship between these two forces. The reason why I call them masculine and feminine is because of the moment that we're living as humans in the world today. We are, like it or not, shaped by our cultural norms. So we're shaped by often a mother and a father. Even if the father was absent or the mother was absent, we're shaped by the relationships that the women in our motherline had with men, our grandmothers and our grandfathers, our great-grandmothers and our great-grandfathers, etc. We are shaped in a society, in cultures that have masculine and feminine identities. So it's not that we're talking about gender, but we're talking about what shaped these inner forces. And in the same way as we are shaped by our upbringing, we're shaped by our ancestry, we're shaped by our geography, we're shaped by our culture, we're shaped by our the collective media, we're also shaped inside ourselves. Take that back. The feminine in me is shaped consciously by all these things because I identify as a woman, but my inner masculine force is shaped by the men in my lineage, my father, the men in my life, the way that society sees men, etc. And I've sort of internalized that because I identify as a woman. So this inner framework of what it is to be alive and healthy is a harmonious, sacred inner marriage between these opposing forces. So if you don't want to call them masculine and feminine, you could call them yin and yang, you could call them conscious and unconscious, you could call them soul and spirit, as I said. But we heal these imbalances, in my experience, by looking and understanding how the outer dynamics in our childhood, in our ancestral stories, in our mothers, grandmothers, and their relationships, and how these have affected our inner union. So, for example, the questions I could ask you, just like this, is, was there a tyrannical masculine force in your motherline that traumatized the generations? There was in mine. It started off with colonization, and then as the generations went on, there was often a very imbalanced, often violent relationship between the men and the women. Women were powerless. Their language was not honoured. They couldn't have money. This is my line. And so I, at the end of the line, had internalized unconsciously, subtly, this dynamic, and it was playing out throughout my life inside me. And because it was playing out inside me, it would also play out in the world that I inhabited. So a lot of my healing was really picking all that apart and seeing what was happening inside me by looking at what was happening on the outside. So by identifying and pinpointing these things, they helped me to understand what was playing out within myself. So once we see the dynamic, and I mean, I'm butchering it because I'm just talking about this in a very quick way. It's big work and there's lots of levels to it. But once we see the dynamic and sense in what ways we are holding it and projecting it, for example, onto the opposite sex. So I had internalized this tyrannical energy of the masculine in my motherline, and I had it inside me, I'd internalized it. So then because it's in my shadow, what happens with the shadow is that we project it. One way we understand the shadow, or we can see our shadow, is through projections. So I would choose men who were domestically violent towards me, who were very narcissistic, who were very dominant, who I had to give my energy and my money to when I was younger. Terrible, unthinkable dynamics in these relationships because they were in me. So I was just projecting it outside and finding men that fulfilled this projection. But because I didn't know it was projection, I carried on falling in love, thinking I was falling in love, but I wasn't. It took me a long time to actually reel it in. So when I was able to be absolutely honest about my own relationships, I was able to start to heal it. And even now in my relationship with Florian, which is a healthy, I'd worked very hard towards this healthy relationship that creates a vessel. In a way, our work with Aromagnosis is really highlighting this, because we're working on this inner union, but we live the outer union. So we're being asked constantly to reel in projections to see what we're unconsciously bringing to our relationship from what's happening inside us. And when I'm absolutely honest, which sometimes it's hard to be, I can see, even in my relationship, which is a healthy relationship today, how I tend to project this shadow of women not trusting men, of the inner masculine that I've internalized, of being, dominant, of being untrustworthy, of being narcissistic. And I project that onto Florian, and I think it's him. I say, you're being like that. I blame him for it, for what is actually playing out within myself. There's another last thing I want to talk about very briefly, and it's called projective identification, which means once we start to project onto someone, they can also very quickly start behaving like that. They identify with the projection. So we get into these fights where, it's our shadows fighting in a way. So my job is to reel that in and say, hang on, if I think Florian's being like that, it's actually what is happening in this inner union. What part of me is still needing me to sort of say, hey, we need to deal with this. I need to reel in the projection and see what I can do with disactivating that part that's playing up inside me. It's about really, when we reel in the projection, it's about taking responsibility for our own inner health. And that's a big part of this work. So ultimately, what are we working towards? We know what a healthy digestive system should feel like and how it should work. We know how a healthy musculature system should work and feel like. So what should a healthy inner life work and feel like? So this is the clarity I wanted to share with you. So ultimately, I believe we are working towards reclaiming the rejected feminine in each individual and collectively. The rejected feminine, if you think of the feminine energy, and I don't mean women, I mean the feminine energy of life, it's matter, matrix, mother, the unconscious, the underworld, the intuitive, instinctive, somatic knowing. And that part of us is being destroyed before our very eyes by the way that we treat the earth that we live in, that is a Mother Earth. So we need to, in a way, delve deep inside us. Part of the work is using your mother line to see what happened and see where and how was the feminine rejected in my lineage. Where is this rejected feminine, and how do I go back and reclaim her? I had a dream not that long ago, probably 6 months ago, or maybe a year ago, of the shadow I was carrying, the feminine shadow of this rejected feminine that came from my, the story I live in, which is the story of my family system, which includes my ancestors. And it was terrifying to see this bedraggled, the worst, most dejected, poorest, downridden, sort of like a rat in an alley or in a drain, and it was this woman with 2 children. And at first I was terrified of her. I didn't want to go near there or her. I was screaming at the child who came near me, and then I realized she was an exact mirror image of myself. She was my shadow. And I realized all my life how I'd never wanted to, I couldn't own anything. I didn't have any self-worth because I was carrying this shadow from my mother line. And that's another story. But anyway, part of the work is reclaiming. So now I can give her compassion. I love her. I'm reclaiming the rejected feminine, or the dark goddess within myself. And the other part of that, because it's a sacred union, for me, is we have to somehow disactivate the internalized tyrant that has been, falsely identified with patriarchy and generations of this masculine, of this sort of patriarchal society, and disactivate the tyrant, because he is ostracizing the sacred masculine. He is saying a masculine that cherishes the feminine, that holds space for the feminine, that loves the earth, that sees the aliveness in the rivers, the trees, the fields, the plants, the insects, the birds. That's that is tribal and savage. So that any masculine that holds those values, has been up until recently ostracized by this tyrannical energy that has really identified with the power of patriarchy. So these are all this has to happen inside us. It's not, it plays out in the outer world, but as long as we blame others and say it's your fault, you're doing this, we don't have any responsibility for really. We have to look at it inside ourselves. How are these stories, how are these things playing out, so we can reclaim the rejected feminine and make space by disactivating the tyrant, so that this ostracized sacred masculine come out and cherish the feminine, so that humanity can cherish the earth once more. So thank you for listening. That is the clarity I wanted to bring forth today. Lots of love, and come over and sign up for our newsletter at aromagnosis.com and cathysattars.com. See you soon.